Now that we've looked at some of the general issues regarding safe space, we're going to look specifically at the intake process. We're going to look at the intake center's role, how it functions, and how it is staffed. Intake this year will again take place at the Calvary Community Church at 13th and Broadway. The church very generously contributed to use of its fellowship hall for the entire safe space season. This allows us to have a single point of contact for potential guests. They won't have to figure out where the shelter is. They'll know exactly where to go to register for safe space. All guests must go through the intake process unless an exception is approved by the shop team. An example would be guests who are helping with the setup of the shelter after the move. Couple limitations: we don't provide food service at intake. We do have a meal at the shelter. And we don't routinely provide clothing for guests or potential guests. We do have some emergency supplies, sleeping bags, blankets for guests who are, or potential guests who are not allowed in on a particular night because we don't have room for them. Intake takes care of three separate processes. The first is the information collection and agreement to rules. Second is the nightly registration. Third is property storage. And then after that, guests will be transported to that night shelter. Safe Space will collect information from each potential guest. This only occurs one time, and this will include both identification material as well as medical information. At the same time that the guest information is collected, potential guests will be asked to agree to the Safe Space rules. These will be read to the guest by a volunteer, and the guest will sign the form, which will be kept for the remainder of the Safe Space season. Guests who have been excluded for violation of the rules will be required to again agree to them before being allowed back into the program. Nightly registration of guests determines the specific individuals who will be sheltered on any particular night. Guests who stayed with us the previous night are automatically pre-registered for sheltering the next day. We'll call the names from that list first and only go to the wait list if there is space. So guests who were not with us the previous night will be placed on a wait list, and then after 6:30, any remaining slots will be released and we'll call names from the wait list. Guests must agree to allow most of their personal property to be stored overnight. During the property storage process, all personal property will be bagged, other than those items that are specifically allowed into the shelter. There's a poster with the items that are allowed that'll be posted near the property storage area, and any exceptions must be approved by the shelter operation manager and must be logged. The intake team consists of the intake team leader, the property storage lead, property storage volunteers, and monitors. The intake team leader is a core team member who is responsible for overall operation of the intake center. This person oversees both the property storage process and the monitors. The team leader will set up the intake center prior to arrival of other volunteers and guests. With the shelter operations manager, conduct the nightly registration process, determining who's admitted that night. Organize the movement of guests to the bus for transportation to the shelter. Organize movement of guest property to the property transport vehicle. After transportation, organize the cleanup of the intake center, secure the center, and refer any issues to the shelter operations manager. The property storage lead is responsible for the property storage process. This person will oversee the property storage volunteers, but will also participate directly in the process. The property storage lead will have to assist property storage volunteers with issues of what is allowed to be brought in a shelter, particularly those who have not volunteered prior will need to be educated regarding this, of seeing what's allowed in and what isn't. And the property storage person will also, the lead will also assist volunteers with any guest problems. The lead will help to keep the flow of guests moving to the property storage area and through it, and refer any issues or problems up to the intake center leader. Property storage volunteers will greet guests as they enter the process. They'll seek to ensure that all property is stored and to prevent any contraband items from being brought into the shelter. They'll assist guests with placing belongings into the property storage bag and put an identification tag on it with the guest's first initial or first name, last initial, and their registration number. They'll provide a clear storage bag for the allowed items, answer any guest questions, and refer any issues up to the property storage lead. The job of monitors is to ensure the safety of guests, volunteers, and the facility. Monitors may be assigned to either upstairs or downstairs. They should walk around the intake center, and that includes walking around the church as well as the downstairs, and communicate with guests, assisting them as needed. They should watch for any problems with those who are waiting and communicate to the intake team leader if needed. As available, the monitors will help to move property from downstairs up to the property vehicle. Upstairs monitors will help to keep guests in line during the bus loading process. They'll check for the ID number for which group is being allowed in to that particular bus, and they'll observe for any non-allowed items, food, drink, and property not in clear bags. After all guests have been transported, the monitors will help the intake team leader with closing of the intake area and ensure that the intake facility and the outside area are cleaned up. While only a few individuals are being titled with monitors, all volunteers really should be watching for conflict or problems and trying to resolve them. Nightly volunteers should contact the team leader as needed, and core volunteers should contact the shelter operations manager with any unresolved issues. Intake flow. Guests are going to gather on West 13th Street near the church. We ask that they not come till 5:30, which is to help the neighbors who really don't like us there and will complain if we gather too early. The shelter operations manager and the intake team leader will call names from the pre-registration list and the wait list. Guests will enter the intake center through the stairs to property storage. Their property is placed in property bags and stored behind the table, and later bags will be moved upstairs to the property transport vehicle. Following property storage, guests may elect to wait either in the downstairs waiting area or outside until they're called for transportation to the shelter. They may wait downstairs, including the back area away from the property storage crew, but the kitchen area and the area behind the pool table are off limits. The timeline for the shelter, at 5 o'clock, the shelter operations manager and the intake team leader will arrive and set up the center. Intake monitors and the property lead will arrive at 5:30. This is also when guests will start arriving. The property volunteers should be there around 5:45 and will start the intake process at 6 o'clock. At 6:30, any pre-registration spots will be released if the guest has not shown up, and at that point we'll go to the wait list. We hope to finish the intake process and transport around 7 o'clock and be able to clean up the intake center and the surrounding area and get the intake team home by 7:30. The next video will get into the specifics of the intake process.